Around 20,000 Illinois kids are in the care of the Department of Children and Family Services. It was the focus of statewide lawmakers today during a House Adoption and Child Welfare Committee hearing. Illinois Capitol Bureau Chief Max Cotton has more.
State lawmakers heard directly from DCFS leaders, placement agencies, and foster parents themselves Thursday about the good and bad of the state system. DCFS officials say last year, around 4% of kids who were the subjects of investigations ended up being placed in care, and about 70% of those were placed with relatives.
We meet with the parents, we talk to them about who their supports are. We have a number of clinically evaluated forms that help us to have these really important conversations so that parents can identify who their family members are, to provide the least amount of trauma when we have to take a child into our care.
It gets more complex when there's no family member available. Kids then have to be placed in foster care or a group home or shelter. To do that, DCFS often teams up with private organizations such as Lutheran Social Services of Illinois, which is providing foster care services to more than 2,600 kids across the state.
We believe that all foster parents and relative caregivers need support, education, and resources to effectively care for the children in their homes. Parenting a child who's experienced trauma is different from other parenting experiences they may have had.
Foster parents also got the chance to testify. One says he's concerned about kids falling through the cracks as many case managers are overloaded.
And to say that is an understatement. Ours is a relatively simple case. There weren't a lot of parental visits. But when I consider the hours required to manage even our simple case, I'm shocked at what we expect of those who serve us, who serve the children, and who serve the biological parents.
To try and alleviate the burden on caseworkers, DCFS is hiring. Governor Pritzker's proposed budget calls for the agency to add more than 500 employees. One area of particular need, permanency staff who work to place kids in foster care as well as with adoption. In Springfield, Max Cotton, WGEM News.